As the Cardano critics venture deeper into that zone, somewhere in the overlapping area between the anger hate phase and the bargaining phase in our Cardano denial curve, it seems like people are still sleeping on some very black and white, stark distinctions between Cardano and Ethereum in terms of determinism, the overall palatability of the staking regimes, and native tokens. Ready? Let's go. I know the Cardano critics are making a lot of noise right now, and they're trying really hard to get the Cardano community to engage in certain types of debates with them. But to be honest, I don't know that we really get anything out of it on our side. There are a lot of ways that we can expend our energy, and I think the kinds of debates that those characters want to have are the kinds that would appeal to your ego. But even if you were to somehow win the debate, which I don't really think is actually possible, like I don't think you could actually convince the vast majority of these characters of anything. But even if you could, I don't know that there's really a positive yield to it. You'll remember from clear back on June 19th of this year, episode number 95, we discussed the Cardano denial curve. This is this evolution that Bitcoin and Ethereum maximalists are going through, where at first they're in shock and denial. How could this Cardano thing be at the number 3 spot on all the charts? How could it be almost as big as Bitcoin and Ethereum? How could it be so popular? Then they go into this angry, hateful kind of stage where they are still kind of in shock, but now they're just more angry about it. They're starting to express their frustration over this thing that is developing, this Cardano thing. Then they go into this bargaining phase where they're like, okay, maybe Cardano is very promising and very good, very performant in the following 12 categories. Maybe it has these following 12 things that are super awesome about it, but it has this one problem. It has this one problem that's fatal. That's why we can still dismiss Cardano. Once all that bargaining gets worn through, once there's no way for them to bargain anymore, they fall into this depression where they realize they're no longer in this binary world of Bitcoin and Ethereum and nothing else even matters. It's either Bitcoin, Ethereum, or nothing else. They're not there yet, and they're certainly not where I actually believe Vitalik is already. I think Vitalik is already in the acceptance phase. I believe Vitalik already knows, and I think he knew this a year ago, even probably longer than that, maybe 2 years ago. He knew that Ethereum would never be able to keep a hold on its hegemonic position as the only smart contract game in town that really mattered. I think even 2 years ago, he realized, oh, wow, there's a huge problem with the sharding we had kind of gotten the world to believe was going to happen in our global state. I think he already knew there was a huge problem. That's when he started saying things like, I don't even want to call it Ethereum 2.0 anymore. It's more of a gradual process of evolution. It's not this one big jump. And by the way, we're not really going to have sharding, when you guys thought we would. That's like probably further down the road. Instead, we're going to have L2 with ZK rollups. I think Vitalik, as soon as he moved to that position, I think he was already in the acceptance phase. But many, many, many Ethereum and Bitcoin maximalists are not there yet. They're somewhere in this gray area between anger, hate, and bargaining, where they're still very angry and hateful, but they're already realizing that they need to start bargaining and explaining like, okay, we probably need to capitulate on the following 12 things that Cardano does better, but we think blank thing is the fatal flaw in Cardano, and that's why Cardano still doesn't matter. And that thing's going to change. I think everybody's aware that over the last few days, that thing has been concurrency, despite the fact that multiple parties have come out and explained how they've already solved concurrency. And we've had big explainer videos by Charles talking about like the many different ways in which you could solve concurrency now and in the future. That doesn't matter because they're in the bargaining phase. They're going to keep bargaining no matter what. And here's why we don't get much out of the debates they want to have with us. Even if we were to somehow, air quotes, win the debate, here's why we wouldn't get much out of it. They want to pre-frame the context of the conversation right now to only talk about the one issue, concurrency. It doesn't matter that multiple parties have stepped up and said it's been solved, because they need to talk about something. They need to bargain. They need to frame the conversation, because what they really don't want to talk about are the stark distinctions between Ethereum and Cardano in terms of things like determinism, the overall palatability of the staking regimes in the two systems, and things like native tokens. Plus, even if you did, air quotes, win the debate with one of these Cardano critics, and you made them look like fools because the logical power of your points was so much more potent than any of their points, something like that. The audience of these types of Twitter personalities is just a bunch of people like them. It's a bunch of other maximalists. And when I say maximalists, it's not because of the theoretical underpinnings of the blockchain that they're supporting. It's because they were early adopters. It's because they have a bunch of money sunk into that blockchain. It's because they made a financial bet on that blockchain. They can't unmake that bet and somehow become a 2018 adopter of Cardano. That's not going to happen. They can't switch the bet now. And their audience, a lot of their audience is other people who also can't switch their bet now. They might, they might capitulate down the road, but they can't really switch their bet. So they're going to keep pushing for their blockchain that they're early adopters of. These aren't the people that need to be convinced and will be convinced. These are people who already have a sunk cost in a competitor. These aren't the people we should devote our energy to communicating with. But let's take a second and talk about the things that they don't want to talk about, the things that actually matter. Things like determinism. This is a really stark contrast between Ethereum and Cardano. Ask yourself this question. You've got to send some money somewhere, and blockchains never existed. And there's two banks. You go into one bank and you're like, hey, I need to send some money halfway around the world. And the people at the bank tell you, okay, sweet, happy to make it happen. We're the best bank in the world. The thing is, when you try to send this money around, halfway around the world, we don't actually know how much it's going to cost. What we suggest you do is you take whatever amount of money you want to send, whether it's $1 or $5 million, and we kind of think it will cost this absurd amount of money to send it. But we don't really know because there's no way to calculate it. So you should just send like a transaction fee of 5x the absurd amount that we think it costs. Because, by the way, if your transaction doesn't go through, which it might not in our system, it just might not go through. If your transaction doesn't go through, we still take your transaction fee. That's one bank. Right next to it is another bank. You walk in and you're like, hey, I want to send some money halfway around the world. How much is it going to cost? And they're like, 60 cents, 20 cents. They tell you some absurdly low amount of money. And you're like, okay, right, but I need to 5x that, just like the bank next door, because you can't actually calculate it. And they're like, no, we have determinism at our bank in our transactions, and we can actually tell you exactly how much it's going to cost. It's going to cost you 20 cents. And you're like, okay, cool, but if my transaction doesn't go through, like transactions probably fail a lot, just like at the bank next door, and if it doesn't go through, you still steal my 20 cents, right? And they're like, no, if your transaction doesn't go through, we don't take your 20 cents. Would you ever in any universe choose the bank, the first bank that does all the bad things with the transaction fees and can't actually tell you how much the transaction is going to cost? That bank wouldn't ever be a player in the financial transaction space. They wouldn't be able to compete with the second bank ever unless there wasn't yet a second bank. That's the situation we find ourselves in right now. Here's an awesome article written by Paulina Vinogradova. She lays out determinism in Cardano. I apologize, I'm sure I butchered her name, but she lays out determinism in Cardano and all the good things about it, the problems that account balance blockchains with global state like Ethereum run into. And it's not really an exaggeration to compare it to those two fictional banks. I mean, that's exactly what we have going on in Ethereum. Everyone in Ethereum hates it, maybe except for miners who get to keep all those transaction fees for transactions that aren't even run, and also get to engage in things like miner extractable value because they get to reorder the transactions. It's a completely different topic, but miners probably don't mind all this extra collection and sort of like the inability to actually estimate how much transaction fees are going to cost, which results in people overestimating just so they don't run out of gas before their transaction completes. Miners probably love all this, but no user ever anywhere is going to appreciate the system with these fees that we find in Ethereum. It's a black and white issue. Non-determinism of fees in any service sector sucks. And when the service is sending money, it's terrible. Another black and white issue with Ethereum versus Cardano is the custodial nature of stake pools in Ethereum and the fact that Ethereum staking has slashing. Again, imagine two banks. You walk into the first bank and you're like, hey, I understand I can earn a yield by holding your assets. And the bank is like, oh, yeah, totally. Except you need to be aware that you have to buy the assets and then give them back to us. And we'll like hold on to those. And occasionally banks like ours have lost like 72 million worth of the assets. No big deal. And you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Occasionally banks like yours lose 72 million worth. And they're like, well, yeah, there's like these private keys, and like one time, an institution like ours just kind of like lost the keys. So you're like, wow, that sounds terrible. And they're like, also, you should be aware that we're like part of this network and nothing to worry about, but there's this thing called slashing. And if like we screw up, if we do something that the network doesn't like, it's possible that the network just kind of like deletes your assets also. It's slashing. It's all good. We have to do it. We totally have to do it to prevent malicious banks from ruining the network. And you're like, wow, okay, there's two different ways I can like lose all my money here. Either you just lose them because you lose the private keys or something, or I get slashed because you guys made a mistake. And they're like, yeah, but don't worry. Everybody's doing it. Everybody's holding these assets. It's the big thing to do. Then you go next door to the other bank and they're like, yeah, you can earn a yield. And you're like, okay, well, do I have to give you the assets? And they're like, nope, you can keep them. You don't have to give them to us at all. So we won't even have a chance to lose your assets. There's no private key we hold that's going to allow us to lose your assets. You keep them. You can even keep them in cold storage on a hardware wallet. And then you're like, okay, so this is already better. I don't have to give you possession of my assets. You're not going to be the custodian of my assets. I can self-custody my assets. And so that only leaves the slashing. This is already 50% better. And the second bank is like, oh, by the way, we also don't do slashing. It turns out that we believe in things like science and academics. So we just went out and we engaged with experts in this thing called game theory. And we figured out this thing called Ouroboros that through game theory prevents malicious actors from ruining the network. And it turns out you don't have to do slashing at all. So your assets are never at risk from slashing. If you were given those two choices, there is no way you would go to that first bank. There's no way you go there. If you were going to invest a bunch of money, if you were going to delegate a bunch of money to one of those two schemes, there's no way you would invest in that first one. There's too much risk. They might lose your keys. Like this stake pool here, you might get slashed. Why would you subject yourself to that when you've got the second option? Given the two options, this Ethereum staking system is going to be unpalatable to the end delegators. And don't forget, man, when you look in the Solana documents, they're all about Casper and slashing as well. I don't see how these options are going to be palatable to consumers when they're deciding where to delegate when you have an option that doesn't involve this risk of loss of their assets. Finally, you've got the status of tokens on these various blockchains. I think everybody in the crypto space, okay, not everybody, but a lot of people in the crypto space would agree that tokenization is something that we hope and is probably just going to grow over time. Tokenization is going to get bigger and bigger. There'll just be more and more tokens, both tokens representing things that are not so real world and tokenization of real world things. I mean, just this year, people are calling this, if last summer was DeFi summer, some people are calling this NFT summer that we've just gone through because NFTs were such a big deal. I mean, you couldn't even watch any mainstream coverage of the crypto space without hearing about NFTs and them giving you some super basic definition of fungibility. That was all anybody was talking about. And certainly the story in Cardano has been this gigantic boom in NFTs. But again, we find a really stark difference here. In Ethereum, you have to have smart contracts to do things with tokens. In Cardano, they're native to the blockchain. They're first class citizens, just like ADA. You don't need to write a smart contract that could be exploited. You just mint them directly on chain, which allows some crazy things like Babel fees, paying the transaction fees for transactions involving these native tokens in the token itself. You don't have to have Ethereum in the same account to pay the transaction fees in Ethereum in Cardano. Babel fees aren't here yet, but we've already seen a lot of work in that direction, and they've already kind of laid out exactly how Babel fees would work. These are all things that become possible when we have native tokens like we do in Cardano. These are all things that the critics desperately don't want to talk about because they're such stark improvements over the status quo in Ethereum. All they want to talk about is concurrency. So I say we let them keep talking about concurrency all the way up until the 12th, when they'll get to all concurrently watch deterministic fees, an actually palatable staking regime, and native tokens, plus a whole bunch, an entire galaxy of projects all come alive on the Cardano mainnet. Talk to you tomorrow.